Hi, everybody. Thank you for joining us today on our webinar on alternatives to evaluations using restricted appraisal reports in your practice. My name is John Brennan. I'm the Director of Appraisal Issues with the Appraisal Foundation, and with me is Maggie Hamilton, the Chairperson of the Appraisal Standards Board for 2017.
Hi, everyone.
So we're going to be doing a 1-hour presentation. I'm going to try to address some of the things you may be thinking about and maybe wanting to ask, and we've received questions, and we are going to try to address some of those throughout the presentation. First of all, at the conclusion of the presentation, everyone who is registered and has signed up will receive an email with the sample restricted appraisal reports that have been developed by the Appraisal Standards Board that you will see in this presentation. I want to make sure some people have a little bit misunderstanding, thinking that maybe these are forms that they can use to fill out and complete restricted appraisal reports. That's not what they are. They are examples of what a restricted appraisal report can look like. And I think you'll be pretty surprised as we get through it, the brevity of those forms and how that can comply with USPAP in such a minimal type format. So this is about restricted appraisal reports as a potential alternative to evaluations. It's going to be important to note as we go through this, we will mention it, that performance of evaluations is a completely different thing, and it may require additional reporting beyond what is required for restricted appraisal reports, and we'll touch on that a little bit. And to that end, we are planning another webinar in the very near future that addresses performing evaluations in compliance with USPAP, and we will talk about that a little bit during this presentation as well. We have had questions submitted in advance. We've tried to address several of them in this presentation, and if time permits at the conclusion, we will try to address any of those that we have not yet, but time's going to be a little bit tight, so we're not sure how well that's going to go. So starting with the first slide here, the agenda. We're going to talk about the distinction between appraisals and evaluations, and we understand that as a licensed or certified appraiser or any other appraiser that is complying with USPAP, that an opinion of value is an opinion of value, and that makes it an appraisal. But we will talk about the distinctions there. We'll also talk about something very important, that is to understand the distinction between appraisal development and appraisal reporting. Sometimes people think that with a short, more abbreviated report, that means that there's a more abbreviated development, and that may not be the case. We'll talk then more about the appraisal reporting options in USPAP and how the distinction is between the level of detail required between, let's say, an appraisal report and a restricted appraisal report. And then we'll talk about some special considerations that come into play when using restricted appraisal reports. And then lastly, we will show you the sample restricted appraisal reports that you will receive via email, along with a PDF of this PowerPoint presentation at the conclusion of today's webinar. So with that, to talk about appraisals versus evaluations, I'll turn it over to Maggie Hamilton.
Thanks, John. First of all, I would like to remind you of Title 11 of FIREA. FIREA mandates transactions where federally related financial institutions must obtain appraisals, which, number one, must comply with USPAP, and two, must be performed by licensed or certified appraisers. Along with that, or in addition to that, we have interagency appraisal and evaluation guidelines. Again, the appraisals must comply with USPAP, and they also must be performed by state licensed or certified appraisers. In addition, they must be written and contain sufficient information. They also must analyze and report appropriate deductions and discounts, be based on the established definition of market value as defined by the agency's appraisal regulations, and be performed by state licensed or certified appraisers. And John?
Thanks, Maggie. And so those same interagency appraisal and evaluation guidelines, as the name implies, includes not only the guidelines for appraisals, but for evaluations. And so to kind of contrast the fact that there were just a few bullets that Maggie just read on the prior slide on what is required for appraisals, there are quite a bit more things specifically required for evaluations. But first, let's talk about in what scenarios evaluations can be used. And keep in mind, evaluations is a term that was created by the federal banking agencies to mean something other than an appraisal. So an evaluation can be used currently for real estate loans with a transaction value at or below the threshold amount. Now that threshold amount, otherwise known as de minimis, is currently $250,000. There has been talk about that being increased, and that may happen in the near future, but at this point, the transaction value being at or below $250,000. Now also keep in mind that when we talk about transaction value, when a loan is being made by a federally regulated financial institution, the transaction value is the loan amount. The entire program was set up to protect the Federal Deposit Insurance Fund. So why the loan amount is the transaction value is because that is the exposure to the financial institution. So if the loan amount is below $250,000 and it's a federally regulated financial institution, it still doesn't qualify as a federally related transaction. And in those cases, you can use an evaluation. $250,000 or higher has to be an appraisal. The same allowance for evaluations appears in business loans with a transaction value at or below the threshold. That's currently $1 million. And in extensions of credit in subject to certain criteria that are included within those guidelines. Now, I mentioned that there were relatively few bullets that are required for appraisals in those interagency appraisal and evaluation guidelines. The evaluations, it's quite a bit more descriptive and detailed. So, and this is why, as you'll see, that even the restricted appraisal reports can be much briefer than what an evaluation can based on these guidelines. So to just briefly go through these, they have specific requirements, and at a minimum must include identifying the location of the property, providing a description of the property, an estimate of the property's market value, describing the methods used to confirm the condition and whether an inspection was performed, describing the analysis that was performed, describing the supplemental information considered using an analytical method or tool, and indicating all sources of information in the analysis, including external data sources, market sales databases, tax records, etc., property-specific data such as previous sales data for the subject property or comparable sales information, evidence of the property inspection, the photos of the property, description of the neighborhood, local market conditions. These are all examples of the types of things that are required under these guidelines for evaluations, much more descriptive and detailed than what it says for appraisals. It also must include information on the preparer if the evaluation is performed by a person. So there's got to be information regarding their name, their contact information, etc. Now let's talk about what USPAP says about evaluations. And Maggie, you want to talk to them about Advisory Opinion 13?
I do, thanks. Remember, as I go through this, John has already mentioned that we're planning to do another webinar that's regarding performing evaluations in compliance with USPAP. And this guidance will certainly come into play again when we do that. But I would like to call your attention to Advisory Opinion 13, performing evaluations of real property collateral to conform with USPAP. And there are 3 different sections within the guidance that the ASB has put together. And I'm going to give you the line numbers in the existing USPAP edition we have out now, which is 2016 and 17. And the first reference is lines 35 and 37 that reminds us that appraisers who are bound by USPAP must recognize that an evaluation meets the USPAP definition of appraisal, and appraisers must comply with USPAP when providing such a service. Lines 48 through 50 goes on to remind us that an appraiser who is required to comply with USPAP must meet both the agency's requirements for an evaluation and the requirements of standards 1 and 2 and other applicable parts of USPAP. And the last references are on lines 76 and 77. It says, if the client does not agree to an assignment that allows the appraiser to comply with USPAP and applicable law or regulation, the appraiser must decline or withdraw from the assignment. And this all relates back to the issue of public trust as we look to how USPAP requires us to do certain items. And as a lead-in, we're going to go follow up with that with appraisal development and appraisal reporting. And we're thinking ahead a little bit now for you, and we're looking at what's happening in 2018 and 2019, the addition of USPAP. So when we talk about USPAP containing separate standards for appraisal development and reporting, I'm going to give to you a kind of preview and show you what the development standards are going to be for 2018. And the first of the development standards, of course, is Standard 1, which deals with real property appraisal. Standard 3, which contains appraisal review. Standard 5, which is mass appraisal development. That's one of the self-contained standards that we have right now, listed as Standard 6. Standard 7 is personal property appraisal, and Standard 9 is business appraisal development. USPAP, if you think about it, does not include specific predefined criteria to develop an appraisal. USPAP instead, when you're developing an appraisal, is based on the scope of work that's performed in that appraisal or appraisal review assignment. Scope of work is defined in USPAP as the type and extent of research and analysis in an appraisal or appraisal review assignment. And so that's important to remember as you're looking at the development aspects of the standards. The USPAP standards for appraisal reporting for 2018, 2019, and some that are current now are Standard 2, which is the reporting of real property appraisal. Standard 4, which is the component of appraisal review reporting, which used to be contained or is contained right now in Standard 3. Standard 6, which is the mass appraisal reporting component, new also in 2018. And Standard 8, which is personal property appraisal, and Standard 10, business appraisal.
Great, Maggie, thanks. So you've mentioned, we've talked about the differences in development and reporting, and we just talked about the different reporting standards in USPAP. Now let's dive a little bit deeper and let's talk about the reporting options, and particularly related to this webinar for Standards 2, real property, standard 8 personal property, and standard 10 business appraisal, we have 2 report options: appraisal reports and restricted appraisal reports. Restricted appraisal reports allow for reporting a lesser level of detail. This is important to understand. This is not development. We talk to people who talk about a limited scope appraisal, etc. We are talking about reporting at this point, not development. So the comment to standards rules 2.2, 8.2, and 10.2 state in part, the essential difference between these 2 options is in the content and level of information provided. The appropriate reporting option and the level of information necessary in the report are dependent on the intended use and the intended users. So with that, let's talk about the distinctions between an appraisal report and a restricted appraisal report. And a really good place to find that is Advisory Opinion 11, which is titled Content of the Appraisal Report Options of Standards Rules 2-2, 8-2, and 10-2. Particularly, there are 2 charts, one for 2-2 and 8-2, that lists side by side an appraisal report, content, level of detail, and a restricted appraisal report. And if we take a look at those a little bit more in detail, as you see on your screen, there really are 3 sections out of the total 12 reporting sections. There are 3 sections where there is a distinction. And as highlighted, the distinction is simply the difference between summarize the information and state the information. So a lot of times people think that there is a tremendous difference between what a restricted appraisal report conveys versus what an appraisal report, and actually there are only 3 areas within the standards rules that it applies to, and again, the application there is summarize versus state, so it's relatively minor in scope. For those that do business valuation appraisals, there's another chart for Standard Rule 10-2, and again, it is very much like the prior one for Standard Rule 2.2 and 8.2, and again, you'll see 3 areas out of the 11 where there is a distinction, and again, that distinction is between summarize and state. So not quite as big as a difference as one might think. Now, Maggie, there's some special considerations when we talk about using restricted appraisal reports. Would you like to go over those?
I would, thank you. Restricted appraisal reports, first, can only be used when there are no intended users beside the client or clients. And that's an important consideration, because there's been a reluctance for people to use those because we have times where they say, well, there's no other intended users that can be named. No, that's true, but there could be co-clients. And there are some instances where perhaps it's more efficient to have 2 clients and they could still then meet the requirements of a restricted appraisal report. So that's, I think, one consideration that perhaps you haven't thought about. That was also a question that we've been asked several times, and there's an FAQ that addresses that in our publication of USPAP. So you might want to look that up in the table of contents back in the FAQs. Secondly, on a restricted appraisal report, there's a requirement for a prominent use restriction that limits the use of the report to the client or clients and warns that the rationale for the appraiser's opinions and conclusions may not be properly understood without additional information in the appraiser's work file. Another question that interestingly came up was, is there a requirement in USPAP to use specific verbiage? And here's an example of how USPAP deals with situations where there's certain information that needs to be given in a report. we don't ask that you use specific verbiage, but we do ask that you put in that restriction and has words to that effect so that the intent is not changed. So there's an example of how USPAP lets you have the flexibility to develop your own statements as you go through and do the special considerations here that you're supposed to do. And the work file consideration is very important with restricted appraisal reports as it is with others, because the work file for a restricted appraisal report must be sufficient to produce an appraisal report, keeping in mind that it's the development of the appraisal that is tremendously important, and that's based on intended use and intended user, where the report itself is a tool. And this is where the client has input as to what kind of content that they want included, what kind of format they want used. So those are things to keep in mind, is the prominent use restriction, client usage only, and work file documentation. And I think as we go on, you're going to see that as we look at these sample restricted appraisal reports, and I stress they're just samples. I'm sure you all have, a lot of you have your own restricted appraisal reports. Some are more brief than others, depending, again, on the scope of work that was necessary to complete the assignment and the intended use. So as we take a look at these, we recognize that you don't have the full-blown in front of you in 8.5 by 11, but you will be getting that in your email. And so I think for our time together, it would be beneficial to look at some of these headings and just to see how brief that you can be in an appraisal report, a restricted appraisal report, and still comply with USPAP. I was amazed myself because I haven't done very many restricted appraisal reports. And when the ASB work groups that initially worked on the 2 reports gave them to me for review, I kept looking for more pages. And I think as appraisers, we tend to do that. So this shows that actually in the residential report, most of the relevant information on the property itself is on 1 page, with the second page containing assumptions, limiting conditions, and a certification. But I think a few things are important to call out to you, that this sample residential appraisal report complies with USPAP Standard Rule 2-2B. And we do have a prominent use restriction at the very beginning. It says, use of this report is limited to the client or clients. In the first instance, we do have more than 1 client. The rationale for how the appraiser arrived at the opinions and conclusions set forth in this report may not be understood properly without additional information that's in the appraiser's work file. So we're saying that, this is very brief. We're giving you our conclusions, but it would make more sense to somebody who had access perhaps to the work file. It's not giving them access, but it is telling them that you have the supporting documentation. And the first parts, of course, are the things that you see in most reports that you do, a subject address. In this instance, it was convenient and easy to do a legal description, and that's one appropriate way of identifying a property. It gives a property type, and it's a 1-line, a 1.1 acre parcel with a 2,255 square foot, 1-story, owner-occupied, single unit residence. The clients, and I did stress the S there, are John Doe and Jane Doe, and it gives their address, and the intended use is to assist the clients in determining an equitable division of assets in a dissolution of marriage. No other uses of this assignment results are intended by the appraiser. So there's your first clue. Here's the first thing, another type of report you might do for litigation purposes, a restricted use. The intended users are John Doe and Jane Doe. The property rights appraised are fee simple, and the type of value is market value. The source of our value definition, always want to have that, is although the appraisal communicated in this report was not prepared for a financial institution, the commonly defined definition of market value found in the federal regulations of the agencies that regulate financial institutions has been used in this assignment. Very brief, very much to the point. Scope of work, out of necessity, deals with, first of all, both on-site interior and exterior inspection of the subject and review of the tax assessor's record, as well as a prior MLS listing of the subject property. The appraiser measured the exterior of the dwelling, and you have the facts of the subject, part of the scope of work, what was done. The sales comparison and cost approaches were developed. Properties such as the subject are seldom rented, and there is no reliable data to develop an income approach. The income approach is not necessary for credible assignment results. And right there, you've conformed with USPAP requirements, you've complied, as it deals with the approaches that were developed, the ones that were omitted, and why they were omitted. The comparable sales data was taken from the local MLS and confirmed via public records and discussions with the listing agents. The lack of sales of properties similar to the subject within the subject neighborhood made it necessary to use sales from surrounding areas. The cost approach was developed using the Marshall and Swift Residential Cost Handbook. And that was the scope of work for this assignment. Told the reader where the information came from. Accountability. Conditions of the appraisal. The appraisal was performed with no extraordinary assumptions or hypothetical conditions. Sale and listing history. There's no current agreement of sale, listing, or option regarding the subject property. Standard Rule 1-5. The lack of sales of property, oops, sorry, got in the wrong line as I'm reading this. Okay. There had been no sales or other transfers of the subject property within 3 years prior to the effective date of this appraisal. The next major section of the report are opinions and conclusions. Highest and best use. Continued use as is. The existing use as a single unit residence contributes to the value of the site. Conversion to any other use would not be legal. That's all that was required in this particular assignment for highest and best use. Exposure time, because the definition value was market value. The appraiser's opinion of reasonable exposure time for the subject property is approximately 120 days. Indicated values. Sales comparison approach, $282,000. Cost approach, $279,000, rounded. The effective date of value, July 1st, 2016. The opinion of market value. The sales comparison approach is the best indicator of value for single unit residential properties in this market. The cost approach supports the value indicated by the sales comparison approach. Therefore, the appraiser's opinion of market value is $282,000. And that is a one-page restricted appraisal report However, under USPAP, to be in compliance with USPAP, you also must have a signed certification as part of the report. So page 2 starts out with assumptions and limiting conditions that are relevant to this report itself. And these will vary by appraiser and by assignment. So the assumptions and limiting conditions in the sample that we provided to you is that the assignment was conducted and the report presented subject to the following assumptions and limiting conditions. The use and acceptance of this report indicates that the client accepts these assumptions and limiting conditions. And then that would be up. We didn't put the specific ones in this sample because most appraisers have their own. The certification is the one that USPAP 2-3 says that it should be similar in content. In this case, we took the one that was in USPAP, made the appropriate deletions where it talks about give the specific or, and it has something in parentheses, so we made it relevant to the property assignment itself. And of course, it's signed and then the date of report over the certification. The certification does allow space for appraisers as necessary to insert additional certifications that may be required by any professional association. And that, in this instance, appropriately addressed the intended use of the intended user's needs. So, in the intended users being the clients only. At the bottom of page 2, because this is a sample, we did put some disclaimers. Those disclaimers were taken right from 2-2B. And so you might want, I would suggest you do read through those. And does this report, would this report meet any restricted residential appraisal report, restricted appraisal report? Maybe not. You may want to use more. I think it shows what little has to actually be reported and comply with the use of the client. We also then have a sample of a non-residential restricted appraisal report. And this sample is for portfolio management. I heard one appraiser ask at a meeting that I was at how can we compete when we have to do so much reporting for to comply with USPAP? We're losing a lot of portfolio work type assignments. This shows again a report that's a little longer than a page. It extends over into the second page, but again, it's very brief and contains a lot of information. And again, it starts out with the same type of prominent use. The use of this report, again, is limited to the clients. In this case, the client is the International Asset Management, or it's an internal, I'm sorry. I need to read a little better. These prints are small. Internal Asset Management, no other uses of this appraisal are intended by the appraiser. The intended user is Jones Widget, Inc., who is part of this internal asset management. No other users of this appraisal are intended by the appraiser. Property rights fee simple, type of value is market value. All right. Again, it did make in the prominent use restriction, it did make reference to the disclaimer that the rationale for how the appraiser arrived at the opinion and conclusions set forth in the report may not be understood properly without additional information that's in the appraiser's work file. It gives the definition of market value. In this instance, it's generally the same as that I already read to you. it references that although it's not prepared for a financial institution, we did the definition of market value that was used was the one that's found in the federal regulations of the agencies. The conditions of the appraisal, again, there were no extraordinary assumptions or hypothetical conditions in this appraisal report, appraisal report. Sales and listing history. There's no current agreement of sale, listing, or option regarding the subject property. There have been no sales or other transfers of the subject property within 3 years prior to the effective date of this appraisal. Probably should have given you a little hint on this before we got into the scope of work, and that was the property type. In this instance, and I think this is relevant to some of you that do the non-residential, this is 100,000 square foot, 5-story, owner-occupied office building on 15 acres. The scope of work to complete this assignment was subject description was obtained from both the interior and exterior inspection, building plans, municipal records, and discussions with the property owner. As detailed below, all 3 approaches to value were developed: the cost, sales comparison, and income capitalization. Comparable sales data for both improved and unimproved properties was taken from local MLS, CoStar, and company records. Sales were confirmed via public records and discussions with parties to the transaction. Additionally, construction costs were obtained from Marshall Swift valuation online service, Swift Estimator. Market rent, expenses, and investment rates were forecast based upon data provided by area professionals, including investors, real estate agents, and building managers. Opinions in conclusion. The existing use is the highest and best use. Exposure time. The appraiser's opinion of reasonable exposure time for the subject property is 3 to 6 months. Effective date of value, May 11th, 2016. Result of approaches to value, cost approach, $35 million. Sales comparison approach, $34 million. Income approach, $31,500,000. The reconciliation, due to the difficulty associated with developing a credible estimate of accrued depreciation, the cost approach is employed only as a test of reasonableness. The market is driven primarily by owner occupants, although the high caliber of the tenant mix draws some investor interest. Therefore, the income approach has been developed, but given minimal weight. Because the strongest demand for the subject is by owner users, most weight was placed on the sales comparison approach. A significant number of comparable sales were available in the subject neighborhood to develop a credible indication of value by the sales comparison approach. This value is also supported by the 2 other approaches to value. The supporting documentation for the analysis and the development of the approaches to value is retained in the appraiser's work file. Opinion of market value, $34 million. Again, we have assumptions and limiting conditions that would be up to the appraiser to insert what's necessary for similar type properties, not property specific necessarily in this instance because they are assumptions. And the certification that as taken from USPAP, the one thing I hadn't caught out before is the the statement, I have performed no services as an appraiser or in any other capacity regarding the property that is the subject of this report within the 3-year period immediately preceding acceptance of this assignment should be called out in all of them, but I had not mentioned that when we talked about other things here. So the certification is, again, specific to this property itself, and again, additional certifications as needed could be added. And having gone through that, again, I'll remind you that the bottom part of this is the disclaimers. It's not necessary that you use those, but since those are a sample, we were just pointing out as much as we could to give you some guidance as you might want to take a look at these for use in preparing your own restricted appraisals reports. John?
Great, Maggie. Thank you for that description. We've got a few advanced questions that have been sent in that we'll try to address a few of them. And while we're pulling that together, one of the things I wanted to point out, when Maggie just mentioned in the certification that disclosure of prior services, sometimes appraisers forget that that requirement in the conduct section of the ethics rule actually requires a disclosure prior to accepting the assignment as well. So it's a dual stage disclosure, one to the client prior to accepting the assignment, and then one in the certification of the actual appraisal report. So Maggie, do you have a question that, let's take a look at a couple. Some of these we did address to the best of our ability during the webinar, and we did receive a few more during the webinar, so we'll see what we can answer here. One of the questions that we got says, when can a restricted appraisal report be used for bank lending that is subject to FIREA? Well, again, you've got two things going on when you're talking about bank lending. You've got appraisals and you've got evaluations. So a restricted appraisal report would fall into the line of appraisals. Could you use it for an evaluation? Yes, but based on what we talked about earlier in the webinar, it might need to include more modifications and have more level of detail than what this restricted appraisal report sample actually does. And that will be touched on in our upcoming webinar about performing evaluations in compliance with USPAP. So if a bank can accept an appraisal, the question comes to whether or not they can accept a restricted appraisal report. And that depends on if there are any other intended users that could not be made co-clients, if they in fact could, if there were no additional intended users besides the client, the lender in this case, the bank could technically accept that subject to their own policies. From the interagency guidelines standpoint, would a restricted appraisal report provide enough information? It's doubtful that that would provide as much information as the guidelines require, but could it be used by that same lender, that same client, in terms of things like portfolio management, like Maggie pointed out? That clearly does meet many of the goals for portfolio management and items like that. We did receive a question that said, can you have several intended users when doing a restricted appraisal report? Well, we did point out that technically you cannot have any additional intended users for a restricted appraisal report beyond the client. However, if those other intended users could engage you along with the client to where you have multiple clients, then that would still be eligible to be used. A restricted appraisal report would still be eligible to be used. There's a question that says, what are the most important uses for the restricted appraisal? Again, when is it most often used? Probably, I'm going to defer to you, Maggie, for your comments on this in a second, but I think generally speaking, you're talking about knowledgeable clients who understand what they're looking for in an appraisal and what they're looking for in terms of the level of detail they need. Again, the restricted appraisal report requires that prominent use restriction saying that there's information in my file. You may not understand all this because there's information in my work file that you're not seeing. So you need an educated client, one that has a level of sophistication. You generally wouldn't be looking at somebody who, for the first time is getting into real estate or getting into lending and not really having an idea of what they're seeing. Maggie, does that kind of make sense to you?
It does. It does. And as a follow-up or follow along with that, we did get a question and that asked about, or actually started out with a statement that said we could really save time and reasonably reduce our fees if, along with a simplified restricted appraisal report, we could simplify the scope of work itself. So for a multi-tenant building, perhaps we could only do the income approach, and for an owner-user building, do just the sales comparison approach. The question is, can you shed any light on when it's acceptable to let simplification help reduce the scope of work and/or fees for budget-oriented clients? And on a USPAP standpoint, if you know on a restricted appraisal report, if you know the client, and as John said, their sophistication and how much they know about the property type itself or the property itself, perhaps an income capitalization approach would be sufficient. And as long as the results are not misleading and the resulting opinion is credible for the intended use, that's what you have to look at. You don't necessarily have to do all three approaches to value in every non-residential report that you do. And on an owner-user building, do just the sales comparison approach. The sample that we gave you, although we had all three approaches to value, we generally found that the cost approach was only used as a test of reasonableness, and that the income approach for this owner-occupied building, although there weren't a lot of tenants in the area, those that were there were high caliber, and so there was enough data to give a supporting approach to value, but it would not have been necessary in all instances. So again, it's hard to give a hard and fast rule, so it's not a one answer fits all, that you always have to look at the intended use and the intended user, because that drives both the scope of work and the amount of work necessary to complete the assignment and have credible results.
That's great information, Maggie. There's also a couple of questions that we've got. Question asking why there are intended users listed on the restricted appraisal report sample. Well, keep in mind, the requirement is that there are no additional intended users beyond the client for a restricted appraisal report. Nevertheless, USPAP still requires that the restricted appraisal report identify the intended users. So that's why you see them. And in a case of a restricted appraisal report, the intended users would match the clients unless for some reason they were identified by type as opposed to by name. We also have some other questions I'll get to in a minute regarding the presentation and the materials and all that. There are some questions as to whether or not an appraisal report performed in a dissolution of marriage, saying that they understand that, well, what if it goes to the court? What if it goes to the judge? Does that not create additional intended users? And the answer is the intended users are established by the appraiser based on communication with the client at the time of the assignment. Although other parties may receive a copy of an appraisal report, it does not automatically mean they are intended users. For example, in this case, if in this dissolution of marriage, the two parties to the marriage had agreed that this appraisal was for them and was not going to the court and was not going to be provided through a judge, there would be no other intended users. Now, might that work its way into a court? It certainly could, but that does not necessarily mean that the court or the judges would be an intended user in that assignment. We do have a very good FAQ regarding this exact topic about how a number of different parties may be in receipt of an appraisal report, but that does not mean necessarily that they become intended users. There was questions about the citation of the definition of value used in the report. Again, there are a couple of people saying this doesn't seem like that's enough, or is that reliable? These are 100% USPAP compliant appraisal reports. And if it's opening some eyes to say, can I really do it that way? The answer is yes. That's the entire reason that we are putting on this webinar, to try to open the eyes to some appraisers that if you work, for example, with forms such as Fannie Mae forms or other forms that have certain level of information and detail and reporting in them, sometimes that goes to become the default for what you do in all your reports, but that's not necessarily required by USPAP. So it's important to understand that you may be able to do less on certain reports depending on what on who the client is, what the intended use is, and who the intended users are. I do want to say there were a couple of questions. If you might have joined late, you will be receiving, if you signed up for this webinar, you will be receiving via email not only those residential and non-residential restricted appraisal report work samples, you will also be receiving a PDF of this presentation as well. And lastly, the presentation will be made available on our website, on the Appraisal Foundation website, a recording of it, as well as the sample material that we just talked about, in the very near future. Maggie, do you have anything else you'd like to add?
I don't at this point, John. Thank you.
Okay. Well, with that, I think we're going to sign off. We had an hour maximum. Looks like we beat it by a few minutes. You see on the screen, on your screen now, you see our contact information. We certainly would be happy to try to answer any additional questions you had related to this webinar, as well as anything else you might have, our phone number, our email address, and of course our website address. So with that, I'd like to thank you all very much for your time, and we hope that we can connect with you again in the future on another webinar.
Yeah, thanks everyone.